What happens when a rural hospital shuts down and your mom has a stroke 47 miles from help? Jasmine Crockett walked into Congress and said what millions were too afraid to. People are dying while you fund fences. In just 5 minutes, she dismantled Marjorie Taylor Greene's attack on public health funding. The fallout: Greene went silent, and Crockett's words sparked a nationwide movement. But what exactly did she say that shook the entire room to its core? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room was cold and sterile, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that drained color from the wood-paneled walls. Leather chairs lined the U-shaped desk, slowly filling with lawmakers in dark suits and tighter expressions. Flags stood stiff behind the podium. Red timers blinked down the seconds. Aides whispered, papers shuffled. No one smiled. The air felt heavy, like a storm about to break. On the live feed, budget oversight hearing, federal health funding. To most, just politics. But in the room, tension cracked like a silent match. Jasmine Crockett sat still, pen moving fast across a notebook. A former Dallas prosecutor, now congresswoman, she was calm, unreadable, watching, not performing. No makeup for cameras, no flair, just a sharp navy suit in sharper silence. She didn't posture, she prepared. Then came Marjorie Taylor Greene, heels loud, folder thick, blazer red. Her entrance was deliberate. She thrived on spectacle. She flipped open her binder like a weapon, filled with screenshots and accusations. No hesitation, no filter. One glance at Crockett, a smirk. In her mind, she was already winning. She had no idea what was coming. Then, without waiting for a cue or glance from the chair, Marjorie Taylor Greene leaned forward and pressed the button on her microphone with a snap. The sound clicked through the room like a starting gun. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't need to. "Let's just be honest here," she said, voice steady but edged with steel. "This hearing, it's not really about helping people. It's about where we're putting our money. And right now, it's going to all the wrong places." She flipped open her binder, turning to a page marked in red, and held up a photo. It showed a mobile health van parked outside a grocery store, a small line of patients waiting outside in lawn chairs. "We're spending millions on this," she said. "Free clinics driving around the country, handing out medicine, treating people who don't even pay into the system. This is what we call healthcare now?" She slapped the photo down on the desk and leaned back just slightly, shoulders squared. "I'm sorry, but this isn't sustainable. It's not even smart. We're pouring billions into programs that don't fix anything. They just keep people dependent. That's not solving a problem. That's making sure it never goes away." She paused in scanning the room. "Meanwhile, our border is wide open. We've got drug cartels walking across with backpacks full of fentanyl, human traffickers, illegal crossings, crime. And instead of dealing with that, we're funding another mobile clinic in Oregon? That doesn't make sense. It's backwards." Now her voice started to rise, not in anger, but with the rhythm of someone hitting a practiced beat. "Here's my proposal. Let's move $3 billion out of these health programs and put it into the southern border, into people and technology that can actually stop threats. I'm talking about boots on the ground, cameras, barriers, real solutions." She looked down, tapped the folder twice. "Because honestly, I'd rather stop a drug runner at the border than pay for a free flu shot at some church in Wisconsin." A low murmur stirred behind her, but she didn't flinch. She welcomed it. "And before anyone says I don't care, this isn't about not caring. It's about being smart with the money we've got. Every dollar should go to protecting American families. And right now, that means securing the border." She turned again, locking eyes with Jasmine Crockett, just long enough to let it linger. "I know some of you are going to say I'm being heartless. But let me ask you, when did expecting people to follow the rules become a bad thing? When did protecting our country turn into something we have to apologize for?" She picked up her papers, folded them slowly, precisely. "I'm not going to apologize for wanting order. And if it's a choice between another free clinic or stopping the next truckload of fentanyl, yeah, I choose the border." She set the folder down, folded her hands, and leaned back in her chair. No smile, just calm, hard certainty. She'd made her point, and now she was waiting, watching to see who'd push back first. And just when the room began to settle, Greene made her next move, the kind you don't walk back from. She reached into her folder, pulled out a small remote, and clicked it toward the screen behind her. A video flickered to life. No graphics, no music, just raw cell phone footage, shaky, grainy, unpolished. A mobile health van parked outside a food bank in rural Alabama. Volunteers moved briskly between dusty cars, handing out brown paper bags and bottles of water. Mothers bounced toddlers on tired hips. Elderly men leaned on walkers. A teenage boy with a bandage on his arm stood with his eyes fixed forward. Beneath a makeshift canopy, community health outreach, free today. The line stretched around the block, some people with umbrellas, others just sweating quietly under the southern sun. The room stayed silent, not out of respect, out of tension. Everyone was waiting to see where this was going. Greene's voice sliced through the stillness. "This is what we're funding," she said, slow and sharp. "Vans driving around like the ice cream man, handing out medication like Halloween candy. No insurance, no ID, no questions. Just show up and get your gift bag." She clicked the remote again. The video froze. A volunteer handed a brown bag to a man in a faded t-shirt and a half-shaven beard. "You call that care?" she asked. "Because to me, it looks like a government-sponsored giveaway." Her voice wasn't angry. It was colder than that, clinical, like she was reading a diagnosis and wanted the room to absorb every word. "These aren't emergency rooms. They're handout stations. And no one is talking about the cost." She didn't pause to let that sink in. She doubled down, reached into her folder again, held up a sheet of paper. "Here's what we found. Case number 1. Male, 38, no job, hasn't filed taxes in 5 years. Walks in, gets free insulin, no paperwork. Says he's between jobs. Been between jobs since 2019. Case number 2. Female, 24, healthy. Gets anxiety meds and birth control because she's stressed about student loans." She looked around the room, a practiced disgust curling in her tone. "This is what we call medical necessity now?" The room was dead still, so still you could hear the hum of the lights above. Greene leaned forward, both palms flat on the table now. "Let me be clear. This isn't about trauma. This isn't about heart attacks in parking lots. This is about comfort, convenience, about building a culture where people are taught not to try. Just show up and Uncle Sam will make it better." She pointed at the frozen frame behind her. "That bag he's holding? That's not medicine. That's a message. It says, you don't have to take responsibility, we'll do it for you. That's not policy, that's surrender." She adjusted her seat but didn't break eye contact with the room. "And before you say, well, isn't that compassion? Let me ask you, what's more compassionate? Giving someone a pill or giving them a reason to get back up? Teaching people to stand, earn, contribute? Because this," she pointed again, stabbing at the air, "this is dependence wrapped in ribbon and called kindness." The final sheet came down like a closing book, folded carefully, deliberately. Then she looked up, not at the committee, not at the chair, but into the camera lens, straight through it. "This is your money," she said to the viewers at home. "Every prescription, every gallon of gas for those vans, every clipboard, it came from your paycheck. And these programs, they want more, billions more." Then with a voice like a verdict, "You call it community health. I call it political charity. The kind that keeps people down and calls it help. And I, for one, am tired of paying for it." She let it sit. Then she turned, not to numbers, not to policy, but to the one person who hadn't said a single word. Jasmine Crockett. She didn't say her name. She didn't need to. Her eyes drifted down the row. Found her. Crockett, still writing, still silent. A slow smile crept across Greene's face. Not warm, not amused. It was the smile of someone convinced they'd already won. "I imagine some of my colleagues across the aisle," she began, drawing the words out like a dare, "will try to tug at your heartstrings today." Her eyes narrowed on Crockett. "Maybe talk about fairness, or feelings, or someone who cried because they couldn't afford a prescription." She dropped her voice, let it sink. I don't do feelings, she said flatly. I do facts. I do numbers. I do national security. Greene leaned back in her chair just slightly, but her posture was anything but relaxed. She was coiled, ready, expecting. Because while you're hearing about pain and moral obligation, I want you to remember this. None of that stops fentanyl. None of that secures a border. None of that fixes what's broken. The chairwoman shifted, sensing the tension cresting, but Greene pushed once more. Lower now, like a knife sliding under skin. I'm sure Congresswoman Crockett has a few stories prepared, she said, tilting her head. She's probably writing one now. Laughter, low and tight, rippled from her side of the aisle. Greene gave a knowing nod toward the pen in Crockett's hand. She's always writing, always waiting. A pause then. But the country's not waiting. The country's bleeding. Crockett didn't look up. Not yet. But something had changed. A stillness in the air. A shift in gravity. Her shoulders straightened. Her hand paused. Then calmly, without flinching, she turned the page. But Crockett wasn't listening to Greene anymore. Not really. Her body was still there, pen in hand, but her mind had already left the room. She was somewhere else entirely, back in a place Greene had never been, a place no chart could measure, a place no insult could reach. The air in the hearing room faded, replaced by thick summer heat and the low whir of a ceiling fan that did little more than stir the dust. She was 9. Her mother had collapsed on the porch of their rural Texas home, halfway between breathing and silence. No neighbors close enough to hear her fall, no ambulance nearby. The closest clinic was 50 miles out, down a cracked 2-lane road with more cattle than cars. Her uncle drove like his hands were fire, but they still arrived too late to stop the seizure. Not fatal, not that time, but it carved a line in Jasmine's life she never forgot, a line between who gets help and who gets left behind. She remembered watching the nurses scramble, remembered the hum of fluorescent lights above her mother's hospital bed, remembered the words whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. If they'd gotten here just 10 minutes sooner, that sentence became a scar. Not the visible kind, the kind that makes you sit straighter in hearings like this, that keeps your hands steady when someone mocks a mobile clinic. That's why she never interrupts, why she listens before she speaks. Because she knows what happens when no one listens at all. Jasmine's fingers tightened just slightly around her pen, knuckles whitening for half a second before loosening again. She was still writing, facts, dates, quotes, but behind every number was a name, behind every line of data, a life like her mother's. She knew Greene hadn't lived that silence, hadn't stood in a patch of dirt wondering if help would come, before the last breath did. That's why she didn't flinch when Greene called it a gift bag. Because Jasmine had once prayed for a gift like that. Any bag, any van, any nurse with a blood pressure cuff. She wasn't ashamed of it. She remembered what desperation looked like. And she had promised herself long before she stepped into politics that no one else would feel that alone on her watch. So when Jasmine Crockett finally leaned into her microphone, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. Her tone was calm, but there was something beneath it, steel wrapped in velvet. She didn't adjust her seat or flip her hair. She didn't even look at Greene right away. Instead, she looked at the chairwoman, then down at her notes, then slowly lifted her eyes toward the room. Congresswoman Greene, she said, her voice even but heavy with purpose. Have you ever ridden in the back of an ambulance for 40 minutes while someone you love was slipping away? Her words cut through the quiet like glass. Not for a photo op, not for a talking point. I mean, really been there. Middle of the night, no sirens loud enough, just you, the driver, and a growing fear that you're too far from help. She paused, but not to let the silence speak for her. She paused to let the truth breathe. I have, she continued, softer now but no less clear. I was 9 years old. My mother collapsed on our front porch. There wasn't a hospital in our town anymore. They'd shut it down the year before. Budget cuts, staffing shortages. We had no choice but to wait. No paramedics, no urgent care. Just my uncle driving 80 miles an hour down back roads in a pickup truck, hoping we could get to someone, anyone before it was too late. She took a breath, and for a moment the room felt like it had lost oxygen. We made it, but barely. I still remember the nurse whispering to another, 10 more minutes and she wouldn't have made it. You don't forget that, not ever. Her fingers didn't shake, her posture didn't shift, but the room had. Lawmakers who had been looking at their phones were now watching her hands, her face, the way her voice didn't crack even though her words did. So when I hear talk about reallocating billions of dollars away from healthcare, she said, her eyes now locking on Greene, I don't hear strategy. I hear warning signs. I see mothers collapsing on porches with no one coming. I see what happens when we decide some lives are just too far away to care about. She turned back to her notes, not for drama, but for evidence, for reality. Let's talk about Newton County, Missouri, she said, flipping to the first page. Hospital shut down last October. The closest ER is now 47 miles away. There's one clinic left, one nurse. They're open Tuesdays and Thursdays, noon to 5. That's it. No overnight care, no emergency response, no ambulance that gets there in time. She looked around the room. And you want to tell me that money would be better spent on more fences? On more walls? Let me ask you something. What does a wall do for someone having a stroke in the middle of the woods? Greene shifted in her chair. The room felt tighter, smaller. Tension was building, but Crockett didn't let it break. She kept her voice level, her tone surgical. You keep saying this isn't personal, that it's just numbers, just dollars and cents. But for people like me, for where I come from, these aren't statistics. These are stories written in pain, in funerals, in unanswered 911 calls. She paused again. The silence wasn't awkward now. It was earned. It held weight. Then Greene snapped. I didn't come here to listen to stories, she barked, hands slicing through the air. I came to talk about facts, not someone's personal sob story. Her voice was sharper than it had been all morning, louder, a little desperate. But Crockett didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She turned her head slowly, looked Greene in the eye, and replied in the same voice she'd used all along, measured, unshaken. You call it a sob story, she said. I call it Tuesday night in my district. The words landed like thunder without thunder. No shouting, no bravado, just truth. She returned to her notes calmly, as if the room hadn't just been flipped inside out. Because in that moment, Crockett wasn't arguing. She was reminding them, reminding all of them, what they'd come here to pretend didn't exist. But Crockett wasn't finished, because personal stories were only part of the truth. The rest came from facts. Real ones. The kind printed on government letterhead. The kind backed by data and lives. She flipped calmly through the tabs in her binder, stopping at a worn page she'd marked days ago. Let's talk about what we're spending money on, she began, her voice steady but firm. Right now, there's a push for $12 billion to build more walls, buy more border drones, and hand out new contracts for surveillance tech. $12 billion. And we're being told that's necessary, urgent. She paused, then looked straight across the aisle. But when we asked for $300 million to keep dozens of small-town hospitals open last year, we were told no, that it wasn't in the budget, that maybe we could try again next cycle. She shook her head, not in anger, but in disbelief. So let me ask, how does that make sense? We can spend $12 billion to keep people out, but we can't spend $300 million to keep people alive. She flipped to the next page and held up a single highlighted line. In Newton County, Missouri, their only hospital closed last fall. No ER, no maternity ward, just gone. Now the closest emergency care is 47 miles away. That's almost an hour, if the roads are clear. She let the silence hang for a beat. And it's not just Missouri. It's happening all over. Rural hospitals are shutting down because we keep choosing other priorities. And people are dying because of it. She pointed down at the page. The CDC says when a rural hospital closes, the death rate in that area can go up by nearly 30%. That's not a theory. That's not politics. That's people. She turned to a second report, this one thinner but heavier in meaning. FEMA now says that not having local health care is a national risk, same level as a power grid failing or a cyber attack. Why? Because when disasters hit small towns with no doctors, no nurses, and no ambulances, we lose people fast. Not because they did something wrong, but because no one planned to protect them. Her voice dropped slightly, not to soften the blow, but to sharpen it. You keep talking about the border, she said, eyes still on Greene. But what about the people who are already here? What about the dad in Arkansas who dies of a stroke because it took an hour for the ambulance to reach him? What about the mom in Mississippi who tries to make her insulin last 6 extra days because she can't afford to refill it yet? What about the kid with asthma in rural Texas who hasn't seen a real doctor in over a year? She wasn't performing, she was testifying. You say this is about keeping people safe, Crockett said, leaning forward slightly. Well, my idea of safety is making sure a sick child can get to a clinic before it's too late. It's making sure a pregnant woman doesn't have to drive 2 hours just to give birth. It's making sure a 70-year-old veteran doesn't die alone in his trailer because we decided we'd rather buy more motion sensors than pay for a nurse to staff a clinic. Her eyes didn't blink. Her voice didn't shake. We have the money. We just don't want to spend it on the people who need it most. And that's not about national security. That's about national neglect. The room was frozen, but she wasn't done. If we can find $12 billion for walls, we can find $300 million for hospitals. If we say we can't, then we've made a decision, one we should admit out loud, that we care more about guarding lines on a map than we do about keeping people breathing inside them. And then she finished with one sentence, quiet but impossible to ignore. This isn't about immigration. It's about abandonment. And if we keep calling that a policy choice, then we've already decided who gets left behind. But powerful words don't just land, they leave bruises. And as Jasmine Crockett's final sentence echoed through the room, not with force but with calm precision, every eye turned. Not to her, but to the other side of the dais, to Marjorie Taylor Greene. The woman who had started the morning with swagger in her step and fire on her tongue now sat stiff in her chair, her expression caught between forced poise and something quieter, uncertainty. It was subtle at first. Her jaw shifted, then reset. She tried to smirk, the kind she usually wore when she knew the cameras were watching, but this one didn't stick. Her lips moved into a half smile, too fast, too shallow. You're making it dramatic, she said finally, voice a notch higher than before. This isn't Broadway, it's Congress. She laughed, just once. It came out dry. No one laughed with her. She reached for her notes, flipping a page that didn't need flipping. Her fingers hesitated on the paper like they weren't sure what they were looking for. The numbers, the talking points, the punchlines, they were there, but they weren't landing anymore. Not after what Crockett had just laid down. Not after $12 billion was put side by side with insulin, birth, and death. Greene's hand moved to her water bottle. She twisted the cap too hard. It squeaked. She set it down, tapped the table once, then again, not rhythmic, not controlled, just nervous energy with nowhere to go. Across the committee table, no one said anything, not Crockett, not the chairwoman, not even Greene's usual allies. For the first time, the room wasn't reacting to what Greene said. It was reacting to what she didn't say. Her silence spoke louder than her words had all morning. She was staring forward now, but not at anyone in particular. Not like before, when every glance was a calculated jab. Now she was avoiding eye contact, especially with Crockett. Crockett hadn't moved. She hadn't smiled. She hadn't even uncrossed her hands. She didn't have to. She didn't need to lean forward or speak again. She had already done what needed doing, and Greene knew it. Everyone knew it. There was no applause, no outburst. Just the quiet, undeniable feeling of a shift. One of those rare moments in Washington where the room itself knows something real just happened. Greene adjusted her jacket sleeve like it itched. She looked down again at her binder. Still not reading, just looking, as if the numbers could protect her now. But the tone had changed. Her voice, just minutes earlier, so sharp, so sure, now carried a small edge of defense. You're turning this into something it's not, she muttered. Not loud enough to reset the room, but just loud enough to fill the silence. You're playing to emotion. I'm trying to talk facts. But her own voice betrayed her. The confidence was gone. What was left was posture without power. She wasn't debating anymore. She was reacting. And for anyone watching closely, staffers, aides, even the journalists in the back, it was clear. This was the moment the momentum left her side. Not because she had been shouted down, not because someone raised their voice louder than hers, but because someone had the truth and delivered it so plainly that no defense felt real afterward. Greene didn't crumble. She didn't storm out. That wasn't her style. But her hand tapping the desk didn't stop. Her eyes kept drifting away from Crockett. Her laugh, the one that used to rattle a room, had lost its timing. And for the first time all morning, she looked like someone trying to hold on to something that had already slipped through her fingers. And just when it seemed Greene might regain her footing, when she reached for her binder, tapped her notes, adjusted her sleeve like she still had control, Crockett looked up and quietly stripped that illusion away. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move. Her posture was still, her expression steady. But the question she asked next cut through every talking point in the room. "Congresswoman," she began, with a tone so calm it somehow felt louder than Greene's strongest shout. "If your mother lived in a small town in Kansas, and she got sick in the middle of the night, and the roads were closed because of a flood, and the only place giving real-time updates on where the rescue routes were was a public radio station, would you still call that a waste of money?" She let it hang. No rush. No rush was needed. The room froze. No one shifted. No one whispered. Even the reporters stopped typing. The hum of the overhead lights suddenly felt louder, like the only sound left in the entire building. Everyone waited, not because they expected a brilliant response, but because they knew something just changed. Because Crockett hadn't just asked a political question, she'd asked a human one. And now Marjorie Taylor Greene, the woman who had spoken all morning about waste and dependency and real Americans, was on the receiving end of it. Crockett didn't blink. "I want to know," she continued, "would you still call that funding unnecessary? Would you still say public radio is political theater if the only voice your mother could hear in the dark was telling her which road could save her life?" Across the room, Greene shifted. Not confidently, not like before. This wasn't the movement of someone standing their ground. It was the movement of someone suddenly unsure where the ground was. She gave a half laugh, a hollow one, the kind meant to buy time, not land a blow. Her fingers drummed the desk again, but this time it wasn't defiant. It was nervous, restless. She looked up, eyes scanning, but not locking on to anyone. She didn't answer. Instead, she tried to smile. Just barely. A weak twitch at the corners of her mouth, the same look someone wears when they know a camera is still rolling, but the words are gone. "You're twisting it," she mumbled. "You're making it emotional." But Crockett didn't react. She didn't pounce. She just let the weight of the silence return. Because that was the truth. Greene couldn't answer. Not really. Because to answer truthfully would mean admitting that, yes, even she might one day rely on the very system she had spent hours trying to tear down. That her own family in the wrong place, at the wrong time, could be the next to need that wasteful emergency broadcast. That the idea of handouts gets real quiet when it's your mother on the line. The cameras were still rolling, but Greene no longer seemed to care about the angles. She didn't push back. She didn't redirect. She didn't fire another accusation. She simply went quiet, eyes cast down, hands still, face unreadable, not because she had won, but because, in that moment, everyone in the room knew she had nothing left to say. And in that stillness, Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't look smug. She didn't move at all. Because that silence, that was her answer. And it was louder than anything else said that day. And in that silence, something even more unexpected happened. Not a cheer, not a speech, not a dramatic reaction, but a small, quiet shift in the room's balance. Congressman David Keller, a long-serving Republican from Wyoming, sat near the middle of the dais. He wasn't loud, never had been. He didn't court headlines, didn't post clips on Twitter, didn't wear party allegiance like a brand. He was old school, a former rancher turned public servant, known more for his calm than his commentary. He hadn't said a word all morning. Not when Greene launched her first attack. Not when the hearing turned sharp. He just sat there listening, watching, taking it all in. But now as Crockett's words settled over the chamber like dust in a quiet field, there is no policy more important than a human life. Something in his face changed, just slightly. His brow softened. His eyes, weathered and heavy-lidded, lifted from his notes and landed on her. Not with judgment, not with curiosity, but with recognition. There was a pause. Then very slowly, he gave a single nod. Not big, not dramatic, not the kind that demanded cameras. It was the kind of nod a man gives when someone else says what he's been thinking for years, but never said out loud. A nod not of politics, but of truth. He didn't speak. He didn't follow it with a statement. He didn't have to. That one motion said it all. I hear you, and I believe you. It didn't escape the room. The chairwoman glanced sideways. A Democratic staffer's pen froze mid-scribble. Even a junior Republican aide near the back blinked like he wasn't sure what he'd just witnessed. And across the table, Greene sat rigid, still looking down at her paperwork, still tapping her finger. Harder now, like she was trying to drown out what she knew had just happened. Because Greene had spoken for almost an hour, and not once had she received that kind of silent agreement. Not from her side, not from any side. But Crockett had. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't moved from her seat. And yet somehow she had reached across that wide political divide and pulled one person, one conservative, long respected, slow to react, into the space between right and wrong. Not with theatrics, not with spin, but with the one thing even the most hardened politicians can't ignore: lived truth. And Crockett? She saw the nod. Of course she did. But she didn't react. She didn't smile or acknowledge it or let it change her tone. Because this wasn't about winning a moment. This wasn't a game. That nod wasn't applause, it was witness. It was someone saying, "You're right. Even if I can't say it out loud, you're right." It was small, it was quiet, but it was also irreversible. Something had cracked, and everyone knew it. And while the hearing room stayed frozen in silence, something else had already begun outside. Something faster than any debate, louder than any gavel. Without warning, without plan, the line had slipped through the walls of Congress and landed straight in the bloodstream of the internet. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a viral stunt. It was just one sentence. Crockett had said it almost in passing, after everything else had been said, almost too quiet to catch. The American people don't need imaginary borders. They need real clinics. But someone had heard it. Someone had clipped it. Someone had posted it. And by the time she closed her binder, it was already spreading like wildfire. The video was short, 12 seconds. No dramatic music, no flashy edits. Just the camera trained on Crockett's face, her voice low and steady, her eyes locked in truth. The line hit different, not because it was clever, but because it was raw. And because people had been waiting for someone, anyone, to say exactly that. Within an hour, the clip had bounced across TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. People weren't just watching it. They were stitching it, remixing it, repeating it. Someone layered it over photos of shuttered hospitals in Arkansas and empty pharmacy shelves in Nebraska. Another stitched it beside footage of mothers in rural Alabama standing in line at mobile clinics. Someone else set it to a simple piano track, slowed it down, and played it over flashing images of emergency rooms closing one after another across red state counties. The comment sections didn't argue. They confessed. "This is my hometown. We lost our hospital in 2019 and haven't had prenatal care since. My dad had a stroke and we had to drive 90 miles. He didn't make it." A teacher in Kansas filmed her own reaction, holding up the video as tears filled her eyes. This is what we've been trying to say. Not left or right, just real. We're dying out here and nobody's listening." Then the remixes came. One was simple. Crockett's voice, slowed and looped over a beat, her line repeating like a mantra. Real clinics, not walls. Real lives, not lines. It played over drone footage of small towns, gas stations, trailers, long highways with no hospitals in sight. It wasn't flashy. It was quiet. And because of that, it hit harder than anything loud ever could. Teenagers shared it from school libraries. Nurses blasted it on Bluetooth speakers behind clinic desks. A combat vet reposted it with the caption, "I fought overseas. I came home and couldn't get a blood pressure check for 6 weeks." This woman is telling the truth. Local news caught it first, then regional, then national. But the viral moment wasn't about fame. It wasn't about going big. It was about going deep. It was about reaching places that DC rarely thinks about. It was about someone finally saying the quiet part out loud, that we've spent too long pretending concrete and cameras keep us safer than care. That policy without compassion leaves people to die quietly, out of frame. That lives don't stop mattering when they live in towns with no lobbyists. Crockett didn't post it. She didn't promote it. She didn't have to. The country did it for her, because in that moment, millions of Americans weren't watching a politician. They were hearing someone finally speak like a neighbor, and they were ready to pass it on. But while Crockett's words moved across the country like a quiet revolution, Marjorie Taylor Greene's silence began to grow roots. At first, it looked like nothing. Just a skipped interview, a rescheduled press briefing, a vague excuse about travel demands. But those who had followed her for years could tell the difference. She wasn't avoiding the media. She was avoiding the moment. The moment when people would look her in the eye and repeat the one sentence she had no answer for. The people don't need imaginary borders. They need real clinics. It was showing up everywhere now, on handmade signs, on bumper stickers, on the backs of protest t-shirts outside her next event, which she canceled 2 hours before go time without explanation. Her staff scrambled. They circulated new memos. They reworded her statements, but they couldn't rewrite what had already happened. She hadn't lost an argument. She had lost a room and the internet. She still walked the Capitol halls, still kept her head high in public, but her pace had changed. She didn't linger for cameras. She ducked them. She didn't meet reporters' eyes. She waved them off with one-word replies, always in motion. The fire was still there, maybe, but it flickered. The spark she used to weaponize had dimmed, not from embarrassment, but from something harder to spin: exposure. People weren't reacting to her fury anymore. They were noticing its emptiness, because for once, she'd been met not with a louder voice, but with a quieter truth, and it stuck. Meanwhile, on the other side of the building, in a modest office with one staffer and 2 chairs that didn't match, Jasmine Crockett sat quietly as her email filled up by the minute. Not from donors, not from party leaders, but from people. Regular people. The kind who didn't usually write to Washington. Farmers, veterans, teachers, single mothers, grocery clerks. Some of them typed like they were out of practice. Some apologized for bad grammar. Some just wrote one sentence. "You said what needed to be said. I watched it 3 times. You reminded me of my grandmother." But again and again, the phrase that kept returning: "Thank you for not being afraid." She read every single one, sometimes at her desk, sometimes sitting on the floor with her shoes off, too tired to move, sometimes with the lights off, lit only by the glow of her laptop. She didn't reply to most. She couldn't. There were too many, but she remembered the names, remembered the small towns, remembered the stories that sounded like her own. And for every letter that said, "I've never written a politician before," she felt the same pull in her chest, a mix of sorrow and fire. Sorrow that they had been forgotten for so long. Fire that they had found her now. She hadn't asked for that spotlight. She didn't chase it. But the words had come from somewhere honest. Not from strategy, not from spin. From the part of her that still remembered the backseat of that old car, driving her mother through back roads, praying help was still ahead. And now that memory had traveled, passed through microphones, through glass screens, through state lines, and landed in people who had been waiting for someone to speak their pain out loud. They weren't writing to a politician. They were writing to someone they recognized. And Crockett didn't take it as praise. She took it as a promise. And far from Washington, where the noise fades and fields stretch for miles, one old man sat on his porch with a radio humming beside him and heard something he'd been waiting decades to hear. And far from Washington, where the noise fades and fields stretch for miles, one old man sat on his porch with a radio humming beside him and heard something he'd been waiting decades to hear. The early morning light in rural Nebraska spilled across acres of frost-hardened dirt, the kind of land you work whether or not anyone notices. William Harlow had worked it for 72 years. 3 sons, 1 tractor, a radio that never left his side. He didn't trust screens, didn't care for speeches, and hadn't believed a word out of Washington in a long, long time. But that morning, as he sat in his coat with a mug of black coffee and the soft crackle of NPR rolling through the air, he paused, mid-sip. The voice wasn't loud, wasn't angry, but it was firm, clear, director. The people don't need imaginary borders. They need real clinics. That line played once, then again, in a clip rebroadcast between segments. Harlow didn't say a word. He just stared out past the barn, where the wind pushed against the dry stalks like waves across land. After a long moment, he muttered, almost to himself, "That girl, she's not just arguing. She's speaking for us." He didn't mean Democrats. He didn't mean activists. He meant people like him. People who buried wives without paramedics. People who drove themselves to ERs with chest pain and dirt under their nails. People who paid taxes but hadn't seen a real doctor in years because the nearest clinic had closed and the pharmacy shut down the same winter the highway cracked open and never got fixed. He meant the forgotten, not by accident, but by design. And this girl, this congresswoman he'd never heard of before, was saying it out loud. She gets it, he added, this time with more weight. She's seen it, lived it, ain't just talking through her teeth. He didn't stand up, didn't turn the volume up. He didn't need to. The voice had already gotten through, over static, over distance, over years of silence. And sitting right there in a wooden chair he built himself, William Harlow smiled for the first time in a long while during a broadcast from D.C. because someone had finally remembered him. Across the country, far from the Capitol, something strange was happening. Not loud, not sudden, but real. People were listening, not just watching a clip, not just sharing it, but really listening. It started slowly, almost like a whisper. One town, one voice, one screen at a time. Then it spread, in living rooms, break rooms, classrooms, and trucks. Not because someone told them to pay attention, but because someone finally said something that sounded like it was meant for them. In a civics class in rural Tennessee, a teacher named Ms. Danner paused the day's lesson halfway through. She had planned to explain the budget process using a dry diagram and a YouTube animation, but something had shifted since the hearing clip started circulating. She opened her laptop, clicked play, and let her students hear the voice of Representative Jasmine Crockett. The classroom, usually fidgety and half distracted, grew still. Kids who rarely stayed off their phones now leaned on their desks, listening. She didn't tell them what to think. She just let the clip run. The people don't need imaginary borders. They need real clinics. No one spoke right away. Then a voice from the back, Jamal, who hadn't said 10 words all semester, raised his hand. "Why don't more people talk like that?" he asked. "Like, actually talk?" Ms. Danner didn't answer right away. She just looked at him and said softly, "Good question." In a small church outside Flagstaff, Arizona, Pastor Ruben Martinez played the audio from his iPhone through a dusty speaker before Sunday service. He didn't say who was speaking. He didn't call it politics. He just let the line hang in the air as families filed in. He watched as people paused mid-step. A mother stopped her daughter from running up the aisle. An older couple in the third pew turned to each other. When the service began, Ruben didn't reference the speaker by name. He just said, "Sometimes the truth doesn't need a pulpit. It just needs to be said." And his congregation nodded in quiet agreement. In Detroit, a bus driver named Alicia replayed the clip on her lunch break, again and again. She didn't know who Crockett was, but the way she said it, not yelling, not preaching, just saying it plain, felt like something Alicia had been trying to explain to her union rep for 5 years. She sent the video to her sister, a nurse in Lansing, who called her back 20 minutes later in tears. "This is what it's like every day," she said. Every damn day in a hospital hallway in Charleston, West Virginia. A third-year nurse named Carly watched the clip with her back against the wall, scrolling through the flood of reactions. Her shift had started at 5 a.m. She hadn't had a break in 4 hours. The clinic was short 3 people. The waiting room was full. She was tired, not just physically, but spiritually. But hearing Crockett speak, hearing someone in power talk about clinics like they mattered, felt like someone had finally noticed. Not the hospital administrators, not the donors, not the board. Someone who'd sat in the waiting room too. She sent the clip to every nurse in her unit with a single sentence. She gets it. In Dallas, a truck driver named Jorge sat in his cab on the side of a state highway, engine cooling, radio on low. NPR had just aired a piece about the hearing, followed by a rebroadcast of Crockett's closing remarks. Jorge didn't have time for politics. He didn't trust politicians. But this one sounded different. She didn't sound like she was trying to win. She sounded like she was done watching people lose. He sat with the radio playing long after the story ended. Then he pulled out his phone, opened a messaging app, and typed to his teenage daughter back home. "You need to watch this." She sounds like Abuela used to. In Topeka, Kansas, a grocery store cashier named Marie listened to the clip in the back room while her co-worker took over the register. She watched the video once, then again, then put it on speaker for the others. "This is the lady who shut the other one down," she said, but there was no mockery in her voice, just awe. Her manager, a quiet man named Doug who rarely talked politics, stood behind her and whispered. She wasn't just speaking. She was testifying. Marie nodded, eyes still on the screen. Yeah, it felt like church. In rural Montana, a community clinic had the clip playing on loop on a small monitor in the waiting room. Patients watched while filling out paperwork. One woman pulled out her phone and filmed the screen, then turned the camera on herself and said, "I didn't think anyone in D.C. remembered we existed, but she does." In Baltimore, a group of teenagers in a youth writing workshop played the clip before starting their prompt. "Write what you wish someone would say for you," their instructor told them. One boy raised his hand. She already did. The room went quiet. It wasn't about a viral video anymore. It was about a feeling, something unspoken finally spoken. A pressure released. A quiet grief recognized. In cafes and classrooms, on dusty roads and subway cars, in barber shops and school parking lots. People listened, and they weren't nodding because it was catchy. They were nodding because it was true, because it said what they had been shouting into the void for years. And slowly something else started to happen. People who had never sent a letter to a representative started writing. People who hadn't registered to vote in a decade started looking up deadlines. Not because Crockett had told them to, not because she promised them anything, but because someone had stood in the place where truth is usually filtered out and refused to let it be silenced. The building was nearly empty. Outside the windows, the Capitol dome glowed faintly in the dark, like a lighthouse with no ocean. Washington had gone quiet, at least on the surface. The suits, the lights, the microphones, all packed up hours ago. But inside a second-floor office tucked into a narrow hallway of the Rayburn building, the light was still on. Jasmine Crockett sat behind her desk, jacket off, tie loosened, flats kicked to the side. The soft yellow glow of a desk lamp lit the room. The overhead fluorescence stayed off. It was the kind of light you sit with, not work under. Her phone buzzed every few seconds. A vibration, a new email, a news alert, a DM. She didn't check them. Not right away, not tonight. The adrenaline had faded. The anger too. What was left wasn't pride, and it wasn't relief. It was weight. Not the kind you carry in your arms. The kind that settles behind your ribs. The kind that makes silence feel louder than applause. On her desk, a stack of printed emails sat neatly beside her notepad. She had started printing them out earlier that evening. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted to hold them, to feel the weight of the words in her hands. Every one of them had come in over the last 24 hours. Not from donors, not from campaign managers, from people, real people. She reached for the one on top. Congresswoman Crockett, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but I just watched the hearing. I'm 67. I've never written to a politician before. But when you said we don't need imaginary borders, we need real clinics, I cried. I'm not embarrassed to admit that. I cried because someone finally said what we've been living through. Thank you. Thank you for not being afraid to tell the truth. You weren't just speaking, you were standing up for us. God bless you. Ruth M., Arkansas. Jasmine read it once, then again, then folded it carefully and placed it in a separate pile. Her eyes were tired but not heavy. She wasn't crying, but the corners stung a little. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was full of faces she hadn't met, stories she hadn't lived but recognized anyway. Not because they were hers, but because they could have been. That was the hardest part. She picked up another letter. I'm a nurse in Oklahoma. Our clinic serves 4 counties, 2 nurses, no backup, no overnight staff. People think we're exaggerating when we say we're all they've got. But we are. When you spoke at the hearing, I felt seen. And I didn't expect that. Not from DC, not from anyone. Please don't stop, even when they talk over you, even when they try to twist your words. Please don't stop. She leaned back in her chair, let the words rest in her hands. The screen of her laptop dimmed on its own. She didn't reach to wake it. It could wait. She thought about her mother, that night on the porch, the sirens that never came, the sound of tires over gravel, the words whispered by nurses when they thought a little girl wasn't listening. 10 minutes later and she wouldn't have made it. She had been chasing those 10 minutes her whole life, her whole career, trying to give them back to someone else. It was never about politics, not really. It was about time, about saving someone else from running out of it. She picked up another letter. This one was handwritten, postmarked from Iowa. You don't know me, but I know people like you. And I've waited a long time to hear one of you in that room say what you said. I'm not a Democrat, never been, probably never will be, but you're the first person who's spoken like someone who's actually sat with a sick parent and waited for help that didn't come. That matters more than party. That's character. And I see it. Just thought you should know. That one hit different, not because it crossed the aisle, but because it crossed something bigger. The space between skepticism and belief. The space where most Americans live. Crockett stood up, walked slowly toward the window. The dome outside still glowed, but it felt far away now, smaller, less powerful than the silence in the room. She pressed her hand against the glass, not hard, just enough to feel the chill. She thought about the day, the sharpness of Greene's voice, the stillness when it broke, the look on Keller's face when he nodded from across the aisle. She hadn't set out to make a moment. She hadn't rehearsed that line. They don't need imaginary borders. They need real clinics. It had just come out, like it had been waiting for years in the back of her throat, too heavy to hold any longer. And now it was out there, and people were holding on to it like a lifeline. She turned back to her desk, sat down slowly, took one last email from the pile and opened it. Representative Crockett, I'm 14. My dad works nights. My mom had a seizure last year and we live far from a hospital. We listened to your hearing on the radio. I just wanted to say thank you. I want to be like you one day. Someone who speaks for the people who don't have microphones. Ava, Missouri. That was the one. She sat with it in her lap for a long time. The kind of long that doesn't tick by. The kind you just feel in your chest. She didn't cry, but she breathed differently, heavier, softer, wiser. She looked around the room, the legal pads, the policy books, the clock that hadn't been reset since daylight saving time. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel heroic. She just felt responsible. Responsible for what came next, for what she said tomorrow, for who she carried with her into every room, even if they never knew it. The lights outside dimmed a little as the clouds passed. The city was still moving. Cars, headlines, alerts. But for a moment in that room, everything slowed, and she knew, her bones, that this was the cost of truth. Not attention, not applause, but the weight of knowing people believed you and expected you to keep going. And as the dust finally settled, beyond the headlines, the viral clips, the silence, and the fire, what remained wasn't a moment or a win or a viral line. It was a lesson. This wasn't just a story about a debate. It wasn't about a viral soundbite or a political takedown. It was about the quiet war between those who speak loudest and those who speak last, between what's said for applause and what's said because it's true. It was about Jasmine Crockett sitting in a room that wasn't built for her voice and using it anyway, not to win, but to witness. And in doing so, she didn't just challenge power, she reminded it what it was for. That public service, stripped of ego and stagecraft, is about seeing people no one else bothers to look at, the overlooked, the overworked, the unheard. And the lesson, the one that echoed long after the microphones clicked off, was this: truth spoken quietly is still truth. It does not need a podium or perfect lighting. It does not have to shout to be felt. It just has to be said by someone who's lived close enough to the fire to know what burning looks like. And once that truth is spoken, clearly, without flinching, it becomes impossible to ignore. Crockett didn't show up to grandstand. She didn't perform. She didn't try to humiliate anyone. She simply held up a mirror, steady and still, and asked the room to look. And that's the part that scared them. Not her politics, not her tone, but her clarity. Because it's easy to fight someone who yells. It's much harder to argue with someone who simply refuses to lie. She stood for people who rarely get a seat, for patients in shuttered clinics, for mothers who drive past closed emergency rooms, for the kid in the back of the class who thinks no one in D.C. even knows his town exists. The lesson is this: policy is not abstract. It lives and dies in real places, on real porches, with real consequences. When budgets are cut, it's not numbers that bleed. It's people. And every decision made in rooms like that hearing, every dollar cut or moved or buried in fine print, becomes someone's last ambulance ride, someone's missed warning, someone's story that doesn't get to finish. That's why Crockett didn't blink when Greene shouted. That's why she didn't flinch when mocked. Because she wasn't arguing for attention. She was arguing to be remembered. And through her, people who had never been remembered before, farmers, cashiers, nurses, veterans, mothers, caretakers, finally saw someone carry their voices into a place where silence usually wins. And here's what we learned from that: that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's someone sitting still while the room gets uncomfortable. That impact isn't always a vote. Sometimes it's a nod from across the aisle, or a 3 a.m. letter from someone who thought they didn't matter. That dignity doesn't come from titles. It comes from how you speak when you don't expect to be applauded. The real moral is this: public service means nothing if it doesn't protect the public's most fragile moments. A country cannot claim to be strong if its people are left gasping in parking lots, if truth is treated like noise, if empathy is seen as weakness. Jasmine Crockett showed us that one voice, steady and unshaken, can stop a room full of shouting, that facts delivered without venom are still facts, that pain, when named, becomes power, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in politics is a person who tells the truth and expects nothing in return. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone calls clinics a handout, the room will remember her, the people will remember her, and the truth, no matter how softly it's spoken, will not fade. So now it's your turn. If something stirred in you, if you recognize yourself in those empty clinics, those silenced voices, those late-night ambulance rides that never came, then don't let this story stop here. Share it, speak it, tell your neighbor, write your representative, ask the hard questions no one else wants to ask, because silence is what they count on. They expect people to scroll past, to forget, to go quiet again when the headlines change. But what if we didn't? What if the next time someone tries to call care a handout, you raised your hand and said, no, that's survival? What if the next budget that guts health access wasn't met with tired shrugs, but with thousands of voices that had just found the words they were missing? This isn't about one side or another. It's about refusing to let people die because someone in a suit decided a wall was worth more than a life. And if you've never spoken up before, that's okay. Start now. One voice is how it starts. 10 voices is how it builds. 100 becomes a chorus. And when the room gets loud enough, even the ones who've stopped listening will have no choice but to turn around. So speak, act, fight, not for applause, not for politics, but for someone whose ZIP code has been used against them for far too long. Because if Jasmine Crockett could shake a room by telling the truth, then so can you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.